Hey everyone, welcome back to the Hacker News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories that got the community talking. Out of 27 stories that crossed our radar, we've picked the 5 that really captured the zeitgeist of what's happening in tech and beyond. And let me tell you, yesterday was one of those days where the discussions were just as fascinating as the stories themselves. We've got everything from a fundamental rethinking of how we write code, to corporate font drama, to businesses literally not knowing how to price their products anymore. Plus, we're going to explore whether all those decentralized platforms are actually, well, decentralized. And in true Hacker News fashion, we've even got a story about people analyzing punctuation marks with SQL queries. Yeah, it's going to be that kind of show. So let's jump right in with something that's challenging some of our industry's most sacred cows. All right, so here's a question for you. How many times have you opened up a code base and just felt your brain melt? Our first story, Cognitive Load is What Matters, really struck a chord with the Hacker News community, racking up almost 1,000 points and nearly 300 comments. And honestly, after diving into this one, I can see why it's resonating so deeply. The author makes this really bold claim right off the bat, basically saying that most of our industry's buzzwords and best practices have failed us. Yeah, you heard that right. All those design patterns, architectural principles, the whole clean code movement, they're arguing we've been focusing on the wrong things. Instead, what we should be obsessing over is cognitive load, essentially how much mental effort it takes for a developer to understand and work with code. And here's the kicker. They back it up with some pretty compelling neuroscience. Apparently, we can only hold about 4 chunks of information in our working memory at once. 4, that's it. So when you're trying to trace through some elaborate enterprise architecture with 17 layers of abstraction, well, no wonder your brain feels like it's running out of range. What really got the community fired up was this implicit criticism of what the author calls really smart developers. You know the type. They come in, implement some sophisticated architecture they read about in a blog post, use every design pattern in the Gang of 4 book, and then leave. And the rest of the team is stuck maintaining this monument to their cleverness. The author's basically saying that showing off your technical prowess might actually be harmful to team productivity. Ouch. The Hacker News discussion around this was fascinating. There's this whole debate about what they're calling pile of if statements architecture. Basically, some folks are arguing that sometimes a big, straightforward file with a bunch of if statements is actually easier to understand than some elegant abstractions spread across multiple classes and files. One commenter made this great point. They said, when you're debugging at 3 a.m. during an outage, you want code that's obvious, not clever. But, and this is where it gets interesting, not everyone agrees that simple always equals low cognitive load. User Reactor Dev made this brilliant analogy to driving. Think about it. Driving is incredibly complex. You're operating heavy machinery at high speeds, constantly making split-second decisions, monitoring multiple inputs. But for experienced drivers, the cognitive load is actually pretty low. Why? Because we've internalized all those patterns through repetition and practice. Another user, Marginalia New, pushed back on the idea that smart developers write complex code. They argued the opposite, that truly skilled developers write simpler code because they understand the problem space better. The complexity comes from less experienced developers who don't know how to simplify, or from following readability rules too mechanically without understanding the bigger picture. There was also this really thoughtful discussion about documentation and comments. The consensus seemed to be that the best documentation explains the why, not the what. Like, don't tell me that this function calculates the tax rate. I can see that from the code. Tell me why we're using this specific formula, what edge cases we're handling, what business rules we're implementing. What I found most compelling about this whole conversation is how it challenges some of our industry's sacred cows. We've all been in those meetings where someone proposes adding Redux to a simple React app, or implementing microservices for a team of 3 developers, or you get the idea. And often these decisions are justified with vague appeals to best practices or scalability or separation of concerns. But if we actually measured the cognitive load these choices create versus the problems they solve, would we make different decisions? The article suggests we would, and based on the passionate response from the community, with people sharing war stories about codebases that were theoretically clean but practically incomprehensible, I think they might be onto something. Maybe instead of asking, is this code following solid principles, we should be asking, can a new developer understand this in 15 minutes? It's making me rethink a lot of my own coding choices, honestly. How about you? Are we overcomplicating things in the meme of best practices? Something to think about. Speaking of overcomplicating things and best practices, this cognitive load discussion actually connects perfectly to our next story about decentralization, because if there's one area where we love to add complexity in the name of principles, it's in building decentralized systems. All right, now let's dive into something that's been causing quite a stir on Hacker News. Are we decentralized yet? This website is essentially asking the million-dollar question about all these supposedly decentralized social networks we keep hearing about. So here's what's fascinating. Someone built this real-time tracker that measures just how decentralized platforms like Mastodon and Blue Sky actually are. And they're not just eyeballing it. They're using something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, which, okay, stick with me here, is actually borrowed from economics. It's the same metric regulators use to figure out if, say, one company is dominating an entire market. Pretty clever application, right? The way it works is surprisingly intuitive. If you get a score close to 0, that means users are spread out nicely across tons of different servers. True decentralization. But if you're pushing toward 10,000, well, that's basically one server to rule them all. The site breaks it down into these categories where anything below 100 is highly competitive, which in social networks terms means genuinely decentralized, while anything above 2,500 is highly concentrated, basically the opposite of what these platforms claim to be. What really caught my eye, though, and this sparked some heated debate in the comments, is how they're deliberately grouping together servers that are controlled by the same entity. So like Blue Sky might have multiple personal data servers, but if they're all under Blue Sky's control, the site counts them as one concentrated power center. Same goes for Mastodon's flagship instances. It's a reality check that technical decentralization doesn't automatically mean distributed power. The Hacker News discussion on this got really philosophical, and honestly, some of the best points came from the skeptics. One commenter, Stebelian, made this argument that, look, measuring decentralization might be missing the point entirely. What actually matters, they said, is whether you can avoid censorship and whether the platform can resist enshittification, that gradual decay where platforms get worse and worse as they try to squeeze more value out of users. They pointed out that Blue Sky's account portability might matter more than how many servers there are. And then there's this uncomfortable truth that kept coming up in the discussion. Decentralized systems have this nasty habit of naturally centralizing over time. Think about it. Git was supposed to be completely distributed, but now everyone's on GitHub. Bitcoin was meant to democratize money, but most people just use Coinbase. Email started decentralized with SMTP, and now, well, good luck running your own email server that doesn't get immediately flagged as spam by Gmail. One commenter, Animats, had this really balanced take that resonated with me. They basically said, look, too much decentralization is actually a problem. You can't find anything, nobody's there, it's a ghost town. But too much centralization leads to censorship and control. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And here's the kicker, we haven't really figured out where that sweet spot is yet. The technical barriers are real too. Several people pointed out that running infrastructure for something like AT protocol, which Blue Sky uses, is way more expensive than running a Mastodon instance. We're talking orders of magnitude difference in cost. So even if the protocol allows for decentralization, the economics might push everything toward centralization anyway. What I find most interesting about this whole discussion is that it's forcing us to confront what we actually mean when we say decentralized. Is it just about technical architecture, or is it about power structures, legal jurisdictions, social dynamics? The website acknowledges that real decentralization isn't just about where the servers are located. It's about who controls them, what laws govern them, and whether certain groups have outsized influence. The 380 points and 188 comments this story got shows that people are really grappling with these questions. And honestly, the fact that we're having this conversation, that someone built a tool to actually measure and track this stuff, that's progress. Even if the results aren't as rosy as the decentralized revolution marketing would have us believe. Now, speaking of measuring things that maybe we're overthinking, our next story takes data analysis to a whole new level of meta. Someone actually built a leaderboard tracking who uses M-dashes the most on Hacker News. And before you roll your eyes, wait until you hear why this actually matters. All right, so here's something wonderfully meta for you. Show HN Hacker News M- user leaderboard pre-ChatGPT. And folks, this one really struck a chord with the community. We're talking 326 points and 250 comments worth of discussion about, wait for it, M-dashes. Yes, those long horizontal lines that are somehow both pretentious and elegant at the same time. Now, I couldn't actually access the original leaderboard page, but honestly, the discussion thread itself tells such a fascinating story. Someone basically went through and analyzed who's been using M-dashes, these things, on Hacker News and specifically looked at usage patterns before ChatGPT came along. And why does that matter? Well, it turns out M-dashes have become this unexpected canary in the coal mine for AI-generated text. The technical approaches people shared in the comments are just chef's kiss. We've got users writing SQL queries against the HN dataset, pulling out patterns like they're data archaeologists. One user showed that M- usage has been steadily climbing from 2006 all the way through 2025. Another person pointed out that the raw counts might be misleading. Like, of course, prolific commenters will have more M-dashes total, but what about the ratio per comment? That's the real question. And then there's this whole subplot about platform wars that I didn't see coming. Apparently, if you're on a Mac, creating an M- is as simple as Option-Shift-hyphen. But on Windows or Linux, you're either copying and pasting like it's 1999, or you're memorizing Unicode sequences, or you've set up some elaborate auto-hotkey script. One user literally said they stopped using M-dashes entirely after switching from Mac to Linux because it was just too much hassle. Can you imagine your choice of punctuation being dictated by your operating system? But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of sad, actually. Multiple people in the thread talked about how they've started self-censoring their M- usage because it's become so associated with ChatGPT output. Like, they're worried that using their favorite punctuation mark will make people think they're a bot. One commenter said they used to love M-dashes, but now they feel icky about them. That's actually kind of heartbreaking. We're letting AI change how we write, not because it's better, but because we're afraid of being mistaken for it. The data analysis got pretty sophisticated, too. There's this user, Lockle, who suggested that just counting all M-dashes is too broad. You should really filter for the pattern of word M-word to exclude things like bullet points or language-specific uses. And they're right. Some languages use M-dashes for dialogue, others for lists. It's not all the same thing. What really comes through in this discussion is how a simple punctuation mark has become this weird cultural artifact. Pre-ChatGPT, using M-dashes was maybe a sign you were a bit of a writing nerd. Maybe you read a lot. Maybe you just liked the way they looked. Post-ChatGPT, it's become almost suspicious. Several users admitted they now actively look for M-dashes as a quick heuristic for whether text might be AI-generated. And the irony, oh, the delicious irony, is that now that everyone knows M-dashes are an AI tell, the next generation of models will probably be trained to use them less. So we'll have this brief historical moment where M- frequency peaked, crashed, and maybe someday it will recover when we all forget about this whole thing. The whole discussion has this beautiful mix of technical rigor and existential crisis. Like, we're using BigQuery and SQL to analyze punctuation trends while simultaneously having a philosophical debate about whether AI has ruined a perfectly good piece of typography. Only on Hacker News, right? But here's where it gets juicy. There's actual corporate drama behind this font story. In 2011, Nokia decided to replace their iconic font with something new, and the original font's creator, Eric Spiekermann, did not hold back. He basically roasted the guy who created the replacement, Bruno Mogg, saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Bruno might not create memorable typefaces, but boy does he know how to sell them. Ouch. The kicker? Bruno Mogg apparently worked with the designer of Comic Sans. Make of that what you will. What's really interesting is that Nokia claimed their own font wouldn't work well for UI purposes when they discontinued it. But the author's experiments, especially with the Nokia Sans Wide variant, prove that's complete nonsense. It actually works beautifully as a UI font. So was this really about the font's capabilities, or was it more about corporate politics and someone's ability to sell a new vision? The evidence kind of points to the latter. The Hacker News discussion around this is fascinating because it really splits into two camps. You've got the typography nerds, and I say that with love, who are deep in the weeds about X heights, hinting for low-density displays, and font weights. They're comparing Nokia Sans to modern favorites like Inter, SF Pro, and Segoa UI. One commenter actually went after Inter pretty hard, calling it the blandest typeface possible, like someone just averaged out every sans serif font ever made. That's a take. Then you've got the nostalgia crew, reminiscing about Nokia's golden era. Several people brought up the N800 and N900 devices and the Hilden UI. These were Nokia's attempts at internet tablets before the iPhone changed everything. And interestingly, this contradicts the article's suggestion that Americans might not remember Nokia's dominance. Plenty of American commenters were right there with their Nokia memories. But not everyone's convinced. Some folks looked at Nokia Sans and just shrugged. One person said it looks vertically stretched. Another actually preferred the font on the article's website over Nokia Sans itself. And you know what? That's fair. Typography is incredibly subjective. What strikes me about this whole thing is how it highlights the intersection of design, technology, and corporate decision-making. Here you have a perfectly good font, arguably a great font, that got tossed aside possibly because someone was better at PowerPoint presentations than the original designer. And now, years later, someone's proving that the original was actually better for the exact purpose Nokia claimed it wasn't suitable for. It makes you wonder how many other design decisions in tech are driven by politics and salesmanship rather than actual user needs or technical merit. How many times has the better solution lost out to the better pitch? This Nokia Sans story might seem like a small thing. It's just a font, right? But it's actually a perfect microcosm of how large tech companies sometimes make decisions that prioritize internal dynamics over user experience or even common sense. And honestly, the fact that we're having this conversation in 2024 about a font from a company that's basically irrelevant in the mobile space now, there's something beautifully poetic about that. Nokia Sans outlived Nokia's mobile dominance. The font has more staying power than the empire that created it. Speaking of corporate decisions that don't make sense and their unintended consequences, our final story takes us from the tech world to the broader economy where businesses are dealing with a different kind of chaos entirely. All right, so our last story is something that's got the business world absolutely spinning right now. 6 months into tariffs, businesses have no idea how to price anything. And wow, with 341 comments on Hacker News, people have some strong feelings about this one. You know what's fascinating here? We're not just talking about prices going up or down. We're talking about complete paralysis. Businesses literally don't know what to charge for their products anymore. Imagine running a company where you wake up each morning and you have no idea if that shipment of components you ordered last month is going to cost you 10% more, 25% more, or maybe the tariff gets reversed entirely. It's like trying to play chess while someone keeps changing the rules mid-game. The discussion on Hacker News really zeroes in on this chaos, and there's this incredible data point from New York City that it's jaw-dropping. Last year, NYC created 66,000 jobs in this period. This year, 994. 994. That's not a typo. We're talking about a 98.5% drop in job creation. And multiple commenters are connecting this directly to the uncertainty these tariffs are creating. Here's what's really getting to people, and I think this is the key insight from the discussion. It's not even necessarily the tariffs themselves that are the biggest problem. It's the unpredictability. One commenter made this brilliant point, that businesses can adapt to almost any stable policy environment, even if it's not ideal. You said a 20% tariff? Fine, companies will figure out how to work with that. But when policies are changing week to week, when there's talk of 60% tariffs one day and then maybe exemptions the next, how do you plan for that? How do you sign contracts? How do you hire people when you don't know if you'll be able to afford them next quarter? And the pricing battles happening behind the scenes are just brutal. Retailers and suppliers are basically in this massive game of hot potato, trying to figure out who's going to eat these costs. Do suppliers raise their wholesale prices? Do retailers absorb it and take the margin hit? Do they pass it on to consumers who are already dealing with inflation? Nobody wants to be the one holding the bag, but somebody has to. Now, there was this interesting contrarian view in the discussion. One user, Tuatoru, argued that people are overblowing this whole thing. Their point was that 80% of economic activity is domestic and doesn't involve imports at all. And you know what? Technically, they might have a point about the direct impact. But here's the thing, and other commenters jumped on this. Even domestic businesses use imported components, imported raw materials, imported equipment. That local bakery? Their oven might be imported. Their vanilla extract almost certainly is. The knock-on effects ripple through everything. There was also this rather spicy take from a user called Underlipton, who basically said, good, let these corporations panic. Their argument was that after years of price gouging during COVID, watching companies squirm about not being able to pass costs onto consumers is, well, karma. They're saying corporations should just absorb the losses instead of always making it the consumer's problem. It's a provocative stance, though I'm not sure how sustainable that would be in practice. What really strikes me about this whole situation is how it highlights something we don't talk about enough in tech and business, the importance of boring, predictable policy. We love disruption in tech, right? Move fast, break things, all that. But the foundation of the economy, that needs to be stable. You can't innovate when you're spending all your time just trying to figure out if you'll still be in business next month. The comment threads are full of business owners sharing their personal nightmares. One person mentioned they're just not hiring, period. Too risky. Another talked about having to completely restructure their supply chain 3 times in 6 months. And several people pointed out that this isn't just about imports from one country. These tariff policies are affecting trade relationships globally, creating this cascading uncertainty that nobody really knows how to navigate. You know what this reminds me of? It's like deploying code to production without any staging environment, no rollback plan, and no monitoring. You're just pushing changes live and hoping for the best. Except instead of a website going down, its entire industry's grinding to a halt because nobody knows how to make basic business decisions anymore. The really sobering part is that we're only 6 months in. If businesses are this confused now, what happens at the 1-year mark, the 2-year mark? At some point, this uncertainty itself becomes a form of economic damage that might be worse than any actual tariff could be. And that wraps up our deep dive into yesterday's top hacker news stories. What a journey, right? We started with questioning whether our coding best practices are actually making things worse, explored whether decentralized platforms are living up to their promises, analyzed how a punctuation mark became an AI detection tool, discovered corporate font drama from a decade ago that still matters today, and ended with businesses in complete pricing paralysis. If there's a thread connecting all these stories, it's this: the gap between intention and reality, between what we say we're building and what we actually create. Whether it's clean code that's impossible to understand, decentralized platforms that aren't, or policies meant to protect domestic business that end up paralyzing it, the unintended consequences often matter more than the original goals. These were the top 5 stories that emerged from 27 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, and the discussions around them show how thoughtful and engaged this community can be. From SQL queries analyzing punctuation to neuroscience explaining code complexity, the range of expertise and perspectives never ceases to amaze me. Thanks for listening to the Hacker News Daily podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'll be back tomorrow with another selection of the top stories and discussions from the front page of the internet's water cooler for tech folks. Until then, keep questioning those best practices and maybe ease up on the M-dashes. Or don't. You do you. This has been your host, signing off. Happy hacking, everyone.